Hello, friends. It's your host, Brian James, with a quick note before we get to today's interview. Some of you have been reaching out wondering what's going on with the podcast, and I want to let you know that I am planning on continuing producing episodes. It's always been important for me that this project is an easy and natural extension of my own curiosity and inquiry. I never wanted it to feel like a job. So that means that I might not release episodes for a while, but that doesn't mean that I've just been sitting around. Since the last episode back in September, I've been increasingly busy with my coaching practice, and I've been working on some new projects that I'm really excited to share. The latest is a video series that I've just released that explores the shamanic approach to yoga that I've been developing over the past few years. When considering the prospect of recording this video series, I was sure that I could never fully replicate the experience of the in-person yoga and shamanic journey events that Debbie and I have been doing since about 2017. And I felt a lot of internal resistance to the idea of even attempting to bring this approach into an online format. But with the possibility of in-person events being so uncertain for the foreseeable future, I felt that I had to at least give it a try. So I did. What else could I do? So when approaching the challenge of facilitating the kind of magic that happens when we're in person, it was important for me to film the series in a ceremonial space, surrounded by nature, to help create the right atmosphere. And after searching high and low, I finally found a beautiful yurt just a few kilometers down the road from where we live here on Vancouver Island, and I arranged to rent it for a day. So on December 10th, which was 2 days after my 46th birthday, I recorded a number of sequences that I've workshopped over countless hours of teaching and practice. I then spent many hours editing the footage, recording voiceovers and soundscapes of drumming and chanting, trying to get as close to the live experience as I could. And after all that, I can honestly say that this online offering is the best representation of where I'm at these days with my own practice and my teaching. And it's what I most want to share at this moment. Yoga and shamanism have been so integral to my own healing and growth that it was inevitable that the two paths would, at some point, merge into one. As I've gone deeper into the history and development of yoga, the distinction between yoga and shamanism disappeared. And what I found is that they are both broad terms that essentially refer to nature-based practices that share the goals of facilitating healing and attaining spiritual knowledge and power. So if you're interested in exploring a soulful approach to yoga that goes deeper than hamstrings, hip openers, and handstands, or you're looking for a practice to support your shamanic journeying with or without plant medicines, then this series might be just the thing for you. So that said, I'd like to offer you, the listener, a special discount so you can experience it for yourself. You can use the code MEDICINEPATH for a 15% discount when you purchase the entire video series, which includes 4 different healing vinyasa sequences paired with shamanic drum journey, plus 2 additional practices that invoke the power of the sun and moon through vinyasa and chanting with drum and rattle. As a special bonus for Medicine Path listeners, you can also use the code MEDICINEPATH to get a 15% discount on The Art of Yoga, my signature workshop that teaches you the secrets of skillful sequencing and blends the best of therapeutic vinyasa yoga with the moving meditation of vinyasa flow. You can find a link to both courses in the show notes below or in the resources section of my website, brianjames.ca. Okay, thanks for listening. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the Medicine Path podcast. I'm your host, Brian James. And today I'm speaking with Jungian therapist Jason Smith. Jason is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute-Boston and a member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. He holds a master's degree in counseling psychology with an emphasis in depth psychology from the Pacifica Graduate Institute. He has over 20 years of clinical experience, and he's the past president of the C.G. Jung Institute-Boston, where he currently serves as training analyst and core faculty member in the analytic training program. Jason hosts the podcast Digital Jung, The Symbolic Life in a Technological Age, and is the author of Religious But Not Religious, Living a Symbolic Life, which is published by Chiron Publications. Well, Jason, thanks so much for joining me today. It's really great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Brian. I'm thrilled to be here.
Great. Well, like I mentioned to you earlier, when I first contacted you, I did so because I listened to your podcast and I really appreciated the way that you were able to clearly speak about some aspects of the symbolic life or the psychological life. I really appreciate it. You are able to take concepts that can be kind of like squirrely and fuzzy and really bring them into focus using your own insights, but also drawing from stories and mythology and poetry. So, listening to your podcast, I thought you'd be a great person to talk to about specific topics. And I was thinking, I wanted to talk to you about the archetypes. But like I mentioned last night, I ended up getting the Kindle copy of your book and reading it in bed. It really struck a chord with me, and I could see a lot of my own experience in the book, in the way that you present the reasons why you ended up writing this book. So now all I want to talk to you about is your book, but I haven't read it all. So I'm kind of venturing into uncharted territories or into the unknown, but that's okay because I'm totally comfortable doing that. And I'm just hoping that I'll ask the right questions to help you expand or articulate on what your book's all about. So, just that as an intro. I know we had a certain agenda coming in, but now let's switch gears and talk about probably what's most present for you, which is this book.
Yeah, great. That would be wonderful.
Well, I thought a good way into it would be to talk about this phrase that comes up in the title of both your podcast and your book. So the idea of the symbolic life.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to live a symbolic life?
The symbolic life, it's this phrase that Jung uses in a talk that he gives, right? He's speaking to a group of clergy people, and he's describing the need for what he calls the symbolic life. And when you look through the collected works, you actually never find the phrase again. He uses it in this talk, but it's really striking. And one of the volumes of Jung's collected works is called The Symbolic Life. So it's something that kind of really strikes a chord. For Jung, the idea is that it's a kind of generic way of talking about a religious life. Not so much a religious life in the sense of being part of a particular religion, a particular group, but of a way of engaging in that realm of experience that has been lost to a lot of people because the religions don't function in the same way that maybe they did at one time. And so it's a realm of meaning, and it's a realm of engagement with that larger transcendent dimension and how it impacts our experience of everyday life.
Hmm. Yeah, so I get that. And I get that kind of longing for a more deep and meaningful life, of ways to engage with the mystery of life and the big questions that we have. And I know that many of us didn't grow up in a religious tradition because it's something maybe our parents rejected,
Hmm.
or maybe we grew up in a religious tradition that was in some ways either problematic, or the ritual or the tradition has become kind of not satisfactory anymore. Like it's not kind of filling this desire
Right.
for us. Um, so so what I hear is that we're talking about religion, not necessarily without all of the kind of baggage of some of the Western religious traditions or the Judeo-Christian religions. So you make a distinction in your book, I think very purposefully, using the book religious rather than spiritual, because
Right.
the title of your book, Religious but Not Religious, plays off this common phrase that we hear a lot: I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Because
Right.
religion's become kind of a dirty word in some parts of our culture, anyway. At least in like the kind of new age spiritual communities that I end up in.
Right. Right. Right.
So why the distinction for you, but religious rather than using the word spiritual?
There's a couple of reasons that I do that. One is it's provocative, right? When you hear the word religion, you have a feeling. It doesn't kind of smooth it over, it doesn't make it easy. And it might kind of, well, it might provoke certain responses, either for or against. Um, and the idea of a symbolic life and a religious life is that it involves all of a person's experience, that anything that keeps you too distant from the experience is too safe. So that's one reason, is to kind of uh, stir up as much of the response that a person might have as possible. But the other is, it's not just that. That's a bit arbitrary if it were just that. The other is that for Jung, the word religion functions in the way that we think of the word spirituality. So religion has a particular root, its Latin root, religio or religio, and that has a particular meaning, right? And religio is that which links us to sort of the deeper fundamentals of our experience. So Jung's distinction is between religion, which is a personal, interior, psychological experience, versus a creed. And the creed is the social, kind of institutional dimension. The creed is the thing that you confess, it's the belief that you have. But religion is the life force in it. And the
Mm.
religious experience is the experience of something that is beyond us, right? The experience of that transcendent. And the other piece is that, the spiritual but not religious idea speaks to something important, speaks to a need that we have for some independence from institutional religion. The problem with it is that it's too easy to turn that into a kind of do it yourself spirituality where you pick and choose the things that fit you, that are congenial for you and that you like, and you throw out the things that are challenging and that you don't like. But then nothing really challenges you. Nothing forces you or pushes you to be changed, to be transformed. Um, and so that becomes really, um, a way of avoiding the challenges, the difficulties, the hard work that come with the religious approach. to life.
Yeah, well, I recognize myself in that. And when I read that section of your book, it really struck me because it had me reflecting on my own journey of trying to live a more spiritual life. A more religious life is actually what I think I was looking for,
Mm,
like what you're talking about. And I think many of us who would identify as spiritual but not connected to any particular religious tradition, we end up going to other cultures for to fill that need. And so a lot of us go to the East. I took up yoga, and I've always been kind of interested in Eastern spirituality, but also, something we would call shamanism or animistic traditions.
mm,
Um, and I guess the thing about that is it's maybe easier, like you said, it's less challenging for us to go to another culture because these traditions don't carry the same kind of charge for us that, let's say, just speaking for myself, the Christian tradition might, because of all of the problems with how Christianity's been
right.
implemented and portrayed. So it's maybe easier, like you said, it's less charged, it's less triggering.
Right.
But I wonder at some point, do we have to at some point reckon with our Judeo-Christian roots, for fear that unless we do that, it'll remain in the unconscious and kind of keep creating problems for us down the road as we try to engage with these other traditions? Like, do you think that's necessary that we reckon with what I think is in most of our DNA? If we are of European descent, it's just like the Christianity's in us, whether we want it or not, or the Judaism is in us, whether we want it or not.
Yeah. I think there's a certain element of truth to that. I think there's a lot that's right about that. The move to the East to Buddhism and Taoism and yoga all makes sense because it's mysterious and it opens us to the mystery, and we don't have any of that baggage kind of getting in the way where we think we know everything about what that's all about. And so it opens us, and there's a lot of value to that. And for many people it works. For many people it's a real uh, engaged, rigorous way of transformation and growth. um, Taoism and Buddhism were my kind of entry into the spiritual life, and they're extremely meaningful and valuable. But I found myself missing something personally. That's my experience, right? That there was something that wasn't being touched. And it goes along the lines of what you're saying, where there is in us a relationship to these Christian images. And of course, this doesn't mean one needs to adopt it or engage in it, but they're part of the air we breathe in a way that we don't even know. They're
Mm.
part of the language that we speak. So many of the phrases that kind of roll off our tongue come from biblical passages that we've forgotten are biblical passages. Um, Edward Edinger's a Jungian analyst, was one of sort of the first generation of analysts, and he talks about how, you know, one of the most important images for Western civilization has been the crucifixion. And if we don't have some understanding of that, we've cut off a lot of our roots. Now, that doesn't mean that one becomes a Christian or even has to like the image, but there's something in the image that might live in us, that might live in our experience. Um, Jung makes a statement somewhere in one of his seminars where he says, you can believe whatever you want, but the unconscious religious attitude is what it is. So it may be something that you don't think you believe, but it's in you. So if it is, it's important that we know. Otherwise, it becomes shadow in some way, and it tries to force it on us. And it might be, in fact, that some of what we see in kind of some of the more extreme fundamentalist approaches is that shadow kind of acting out. If we don't have a conscious relationship to it, that part of Christianity just gets to have a field day without any kind of response.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was trying to get to by using the word we like reckoning with it. Not
Yeah,
that we necessarily have to take it up or whatever, but at some point we got to deal with this unconscious. Um, you know, I think you come from the same kind of background that I do, so let's just, for the sake of it, just say Christian. But we could also be talking about Judaism or anything else.
absolutely.
It's just easier for me to draw on my own experience. So we have to somehow deal with this unconscious Christianity. And, it's so funny, like in my yoga practices and in shamanic ceremonies, early on for me, what kind of confused me and surprised me was that the images that were coming up for me in this visionary states were Christian images. And when I'd be in an ayahuasca ceremony, going through this really difficult time, maybe there's something that was making me quite fearful, and you know who I was praying to. It wasn't to Shiva or something else from the yoga tradition or the Hindu
Right,
tradition. I was praying to Jesus or Saint Michael, to come help
right.
me and protect me. And that really kind of surprised me because I didn't grow up with that. But like you said, it was in the air that I breathed, or the water that I was swimming in. It was just the images were there, but maybe not fully conscious and not fully dealt with. And so that set me on this whole exploration of my own Christian roots and trying to find a way to reconcile this tension I felt between wanting to have a spiritual life, but also having this presence there in me and wondering what it was about, and looking at different Christian traditions and not really seeing anything there that I truly resonated with. Like, I really wish I could find a Christian church that still had some really good ritual in it, like that had some good music and like good, like Gnostic kind of ritual where it was about invoking that within each person rather than just looking to the figurehead at the the
Right.
podium, being the only one who could connect to the highest. So if I could find that, that would be so much easier for me because it would kind of resolve these tensions in me, right? But I've yet to really find that.
Yeah, it's a real problem, uh, because there's so much of the tradition that's become an idea, and there's a lot that gets centered around whether you believe or you don't believe. And the reckoning that you talk about, that's a relationship. It's some kind of engagement, uh, where you don't have to worry about the belief or the non-belief, but you have an experience in a relationship, an argument. It doesn't really matter, uh, but it's something that engages you at a more kind of embodied level, at a more kind of heart-centered level, as opposed to these ideas and what Jung calls the creed, the ideas that you're supposed to accept as truth. The ritual engages the person, uh, with the experience. It puts you in the experience, and you come out with a different relationship. And so to have that kind of sense, and that was one of Jung's frustrations with the Christian church, is that it had lost the ability to connect people to what he called the numinous,
Mm-hmm.
right? The transcendent. It was now just a kind of spirituality of sentimentality or belief, but it wasn't connecting people on a deep level to the depths of our own being.
Yeah, well, I feel that, and that's mostly what I found when I've gone out, searching for a church that was still functioning. I think in the kind of the old way, um,
Right.
you know, like I was reflecting on it this morning when I was thinking about talking to you, about my whole kind of engagement with my Christian roots and seeking a Christian church that could like fill me up the way shamanism or yoga does, and my wife and I lived for a couple of years recently in Montreal, and it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the few old Canadian cities, and it's filled with all of these grand old churches. And I remember I would be teaching yoga in like a corporate office, and after those classes, I would walk across the street where there's this beautiful old church and just go and walk around and look at all of the icons. And, it was one of those churches that still had the pipe organ and the psychedelic stained glass. And like, I walk into a place like that and I'm like, this is like a machine for religion, for that relinking that you talked about.
Right.
But what I often find is that it's almost like they've lost the user manual or the technician who could really get that machine humming, you know?
Right.
So like I could see how at a certain point it did function that way, like to connect everyone to the numinous. Like it had the music, the incense, the strange light that would be created, these these amazing, imposing icons, and just inspire that sense of awe and wonder. But when I go into a church now, it's so dry and dull. And I haven't found one yet that still has a lot of juice to it. I've walked by Black Baptist churches and I can hear there's something going on in there, right?
Right. Right.
But I would be just as much an outsider there as I would be in the shaman's hut.
Right. Right. That spirit in the black churches with the singing and the shouting and the calling out, you can hear that it's just full of life. There's a great description by a woman who wrote sort of early 20th century, Evelyn Underhill. She wrote a lot about mysticism and about religion. And she talks about how Christian churches and Christians had become people who were at a symphony and were reading the program, but they weren't listening to the music, and there wasn't a music to listen to, but it was all about like they knew the program inside and out, and they knew the names of the composers, but there wasn't an engagement with the actual music, the actual experience. And that's the real loss. And part of that is there's a loss of our capacity to live in a sense of mystery, particularly in the West. I think it's part of why we go to the East, because it's infused with that sense of uh, the unknowable. And here we think we're supposed to know something, like we're supposed to uh, have it kind of in our grasp, as opposed to your experience when you walk in. All of those images touch you on levels that aren't intellectual. They just go like right past the rational and touch something fundamental. That's where religion happens, not in the head, and not in that kind of sort of dull exposition of things.
Mm, yeah. There's something though, like when we talk about like reckoning with our own religious traditions or roots, even if we're disconnected from them, they're still in us. They're still kind of working on us in some way. I totally get it why you would want to go to something completely different. I think, it was the way it was for me too, is because when you start to question it, engage with it, be with it, however you want to talk about that, um, it can bring up a lot of tension. A tension between the yearning for a real deep, rich spiritual tradition and community that you belong to, and maybe the lack of it in our culture, or the tension between this feeling I have when I look at the image of Christ or Mary, and what I know of the Catholic Church and all the atrocities that they're guilty of. So it brings up all of these uncomfortable tensions. It doesn't bring about a resolution. And so I can understand why people would want to just like totally skip over that and either go to the east or go to the south into some shamanic tradition, or
Mhm.
another move I see people making is kind of going to what they think of as their pre-Christian roots. So going to uh, some murky paganism that we don't really know quite what they were doing back then, but we have kind of an idea that they were a lot like these indigenous people in the South or whatever.
Right, right.
And so we can connect to them because that's something that is easier for us, that doesn't bring up that conflict and tension. Um,
Mhm.
so what do you think about that? Like, do you think, I mean, we can understand that, right? Like, why, of course, you wouldn't want to bring up more conflict and tension and dissatisfaction, of course, but why is it important for us to deal with that? And what is it about that is useful or helpful to us?
That's such a great question. I think you're right. I mean, of course, it's understandable. It's even valuable. It's even necessary. And if that's where the spirit is, if it's in the Eastern traditions, if it's in a shamanic tradition, if that's where aliveness is, go where there's aliveness.
Mm,
That's core. Jung makes this statement where he says, um, you know, it's helpful to learn from the wisdom traditions of all cultures. And if you find yourself with this uh, compulsion to believe, then do it. Don't hesitate. If that's what comes up for you, if you believe in that, or you're drawn to uh, one particular tradition over another, go in that direction. If you believe in God, and that just won't leave you alone, and the Christian tradition calls you, go there. He says, if you find in yourself a refusal to believe, don't hesitate. Don't believe, and see what happens. See how that affects. So there's no dogmatism here,
mm,
but the engagement with the tradition is important on some level. The conflict is difficult. You mentioned the Catholic Church. Uh, there are countless people who have been wounded by their experience of their tradition, um, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, Judaism, Islam, across the board.
mm,
People have been wounded by their tradition. It's hard to go back to a tradition that you've been wounded by, and that might be a time when it's necessary to go somewhere else. My own experience is I wasn't really raised in any tradition in a uh, in an effective way, or a deliberate way. We would go to church on Christmas Eve, kind of thing. So I had a tradition, but not one that I was particularly active in. But that also meant that I'm not wounded, right? I'm not wounded by my tradition. And so I
Mm.
can explore it without a lot of that conflict. But there is something to finding a relationship. It's kind of like finding a relationship to your family and to the
Right.
background that you're in, right?
Mm-hmm.
You may be wounded by that as well, but there's a danger in cutting off, because part of what happens when you cut off from your culture or your family is it doesn't go away. It just goes under the surface. In fact, they may be more present because of that cutoff than if you really kind of work out the challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And so engaging with it, I think, is helpful. The tradition, the religious tradition, is also where so much of the wisdom that comes from that symbolic material has been worked and worked and worked for millennia. And there's more in them than we could ever possibly generate in our own lives in the 80 to 100 years that we're going to be on this planet. There's so much that is available to us, and we don't have enough time as human beings to
Start over.
learn. Right, or to learn how to be human beings.
Mm.
So there is wisdom there, um, that is worth wrestling with, and the conflicts may very well be part of that challenge. There's a great image of in the Bible of Jacob wrestling with the angel. The name Israel in part means struggle with God. And so that idea of struggling with something and wrestling
Right.
with it can strengthen you, even if you don't adopt that experience. You know why you're not adopting it. You're not just acting unconsciously,
Mm.
you're acting very consciously. You have a deep understanding of your relationship to it.
Mm. Yeah. And no, that's so true. And I think often in like, let's say the new age, but maybe it's wider than that. There's an avoidance of struggle and conflict. It's like, let's get to Shanti already.
Mm-hmm.
And what that often involves is a heck of a lot of suppression or bypassing. Like, so we have to be willing to be troubled, right? And
Oh,
so
absolutely.
what I hear from you is that the troubling is a part of the religious life, the struggle, the unknowing, the tensions, all of that is it's I'm struck by these two images. On one hand, we've got like the placid lake of the Buddhist mind, and that's the goal. And on the other hand, we've got this kind of like churning, like there's a Leviathan under the water, or St. George and the dragon wrestling and stirring things up, and not placid at all.
Right, right, right. Except that the goal ultimately, say in the Christian tradition, is the peace that passes all understanding. It is that placid lake that you want to get to, but you can't start there. I mean, we want to get there. We want to, like you say, the bypass. We want to uh, avoid the struggle. I think it is one of the things that Christianity brings to the field of religious experience. Each of these traditions brings their particular perspective, and all of them together kind of are these different ways in different understandings. And one of the things that Christianity does do is it does do that struggle. Its basis is the incarnation, what gets worked out in this life and what gets worked out in the kind of messy human embodied experience of living. And the struggle is, yeah, it doesn't stop. Again, this is a very Jungian point of view too. Jung's fundamental belief about analysis is that it doesn't lead to a cure. You do not get cured by analysis. You change your attitude. You develop an attitude that allows you to engage with the unconscious, to engage the challenges, the vicissitudes, the disruptions of life. So you become resilient, but you're not fixed. He says, we need problems. As soon as we run out of problems, we're not in life anymore. So that struggle is part of the way that we keep creating and developing and growing and deepening our experience.
Yeah. That's something that I've really only been coming to in the past couple years is this acceptance that the struggle maybe never goes away, and maybe we shouldn't want it to go away. I think we get kind of indoctrinated through psychology and New Age spiritualities that peace, like an abiding peace or a stability or centeredness, is possible. First of all, it's raised as a possibility, and it's kind of like a promise. I call it the carrot on the end of a very long stick.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think we get indoctrinated into that, and that leads to a struggle of its own sort, where people are then in this conflict between this ideal, like, God, if Eckhart Tolle can get there, that means that I can too. And then the struggle is, well, how do I get there? And then becomes like the kind of potpourri spirituality where it's like, I'm drawing on all of these things because I'm not getting there with just yoga or just sitting and trying to meditate the mind into submission. And so I think, it's only been for a couple of years where I've really started to just kind of accept that life is always going to be full of this troubling, and that I actually start to enjoy being troubled more and more when I drop the notion that I should be at a more stable, peaceful place all the time, and that I should never be troubled. And like the fact that I'm troubled, it's a sign that my spiritual practice isn't working or I'm not doing enough. And so then maybe I got to become a vegan or something. You know what I mean?
Right, right. I think that plays out on all levels. We see that play out in relationships. It becomes a struggle and we start to go, this isn't fun anymore.
Right.
So, maybe we should call it quits. That might be the moment where the growth starts to happen in that relationship. That doesn't mean that one should stay in difficult situations always, but the struggle is important. One of my favorite Zen stories, I think it's a Zen story that I read once, is a story about a Zen master who's dying, and all his disciples gather around him, and they beg him for one last word, like one last parting word. And he says, I'm afraid of dying. And they all get troubled and they look at each other and they start to go, no, wait a minute. You don't understand that. That can't be the last word. Can you please give us something more than that? And he pauses and he says, I'm really afraid of dying.
Wow.
The ability to be with whatever is, even if it's fear, even if it's that, to me is the peace, is that it's not that
Mm-hmm.
all the trouble goes away. It's that we know how to be with it. We know how to be in the storm as well as in the calm. that's really, for me, the goal of any religious or spiritual practice.
Yeah, yeah, I feel that too. That yeah, it's like peace with all arising conditions, right? Not just with the peaceful,
Right.
harmonious arising conditions. No, it's being at peace, and at being at peace is a kind of acceptance and like a resolute acceptance. Like this too and this too. I love that story because it kind of like at his last moments, his final teaching was to pull the rug out from underneath his students, who figured, well, the end goal is like serenity, but even serenity, I think at its core is more about that that acceptance of whatever is coming up, not just the joyous and the I'm getting caught up in words with of peace and serenity,
Right.
um, but you know what I mean? Like, if everything was just okay out there, then I'm okay too, right?
Right.
And so this demand on the external to conform to this idea of peace and harmony. Whereas maybe the
Right.
greatest spiritual master is the one who's able to just be with it all, and to be to fall apart, or to be emotional. That's another thing that I see it being put up as some kind of ideal, is this emotional detachment. Like when I look at videos of Eckhart Tolle, I'm like, you want to be like that guy? Like, I've never seen someone so kind of dry and dull. And I would just wonder what's going on underneath the surface with that guy. Like, I want to hear from his wife about him getting upset over the eggs in the morning.
Right. Right. That's exactly, the very realized personality. Jung would always say, yes, well, go look at his wife and children and you'll see if there's a shadow kind of in the background.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
So detachment, we I think we get it wrong when we want it to be some relief from the conditions of life, as opposed to, for me, the idea of detachment is whatever, as you said, whatever is arising, to say, yes, this is what's present right now. This is what's here. This is the challenge, but not to push back against it and say, this shouldn't be. It's when we say this shouldn't be that we start to create these conflicts and difficulties and struggles in our experience.
And so maybe we could say it's the same when starting to engage with the religious traditions that you grew up around. Uh, yeah, like it's when we start to push against them or to push them away, that it actually creates the conflict that we're trying to avoid through the the other spiritual practices that we're choosing.
I think that's right. I think we we are looking for it to be something. We're imposing a need on it. We're imposing an image on it. It's part of the way we get things backwards a little bit, is we
Mhm.
try to achieve a universe that fits the thing that we're looking for, and to make it, the meaning of the universe, fit our experience, as opposed to find a way to adapt to the way the universe is. And if this is the symbolic universe, the Christian universe, the Buddhist universe, that symbolic universe is what it is. And if there are things that are troubling, you you engage it and you face it, and then it teaches you something. It might not be an easy lesson to get, but it teaches you something that is not what you already know about yourself, not what you already know about life, but it opens you and expands your experience.
Yeah. You just reminded me. I had highlighted this passage from your book, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read your own book to you for a moment. But I think
Great,
it
thank you.
connects with what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
And when I read this last night, I was struck by it. So, okay, so you say at the same time. Okay, I'm getting at the wrong moment here, but stick with it. At the same time, there's a problem with the spiritual but not religious attitude. All too easily, it becomes an approach by which someone can shape a kind of do it yourself spirituality that reflects who and what the person already is, but that does not challenge that person to become what he or she could be, but is not yet. To reject the structures of religion out of hand because of what one does not like about religion is to run the risk of constructing a merely congenial spirituality that may feel good and may even sometimes be a comfort, but they may lack the capacity to accomplish the kind of growth and transformation that all religious traditions seek to effect. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It takes a kind of courage that's hard to do, to let ourselves be changed, to let things affect us, and to open ourselves to the disturbing, which is part of the role of religion. Part of its role is to subvert our values and push us and challenge us to look at ourselves differently and to grow into the potentials that are in all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm feeling like that's a great way to end this part of the conversation. Anyway, um, there's a lot there. You've got me thinking about it. I can't wait to finish your book because it's raised a whole bunch of stuff for me, and
That's awesome. Great.
yeah, and probably stuff I'm going to be wrestling with for a while. I think kind of bringing up some of these old questions again. Like, something that comes up. I think Jung said at one point, and maybe it was at the end of that whole lecture he did on Kundalini, but he said something to the effect, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he said that the West needs to find its own yoga, or it needs to create a Christian yoga, because he felt that this Christianity was in our DNA, whether we like it or not, and these symbols were embedded in our unconscious psyche. And I've thought about that over the years, being a yoga practitioner, coming from this Christian tradition, having these images come to me in my reverie, and wondering, like, what the hell do I do with that? Like, is it something like what I see out in the world, like like literally Christian yoga, where it's just you take yoga practice and you put it in this context of Christianity. So instead of a statue of Ganesha or Shiva, you've got Christ there or something.
Right,
That
right.
never felt quite right to me. It felt kind of like putting two Lego blocks together didn't quite fit or something. But I'm wondering now, after talking to you, if what he was meaning by yoga is really what yoga actually means and what religion actually means. So, a way to link, a way to connect with the numinous, but a numinous with a particularly Christian flavor, because that's in us whether we want it or not, right? And so
Right.
that we need to find a new way to do that, maybe a new kind of church or a new set of rituals. What do you
Right.
think about that?
I th- I think well, I think you're right. I think that it's not about just replacing the sort of the superficial forms of yoga with Christian iconography and Christian language or something like that. For Jung, it is, I mean, that whole seminar on Kundalini yoga, it's very clear that it's this rich symbolic tradition. It's not just uh, you know um, the way that we sort of many people sort of popularly think of uh, yoga as a form of nice exercise or something like that. It's very rich, symbolic,
Yeah, I call it
beautiful.
spiritualized aerobics.
Yeah, yeah. The body and the mind and the soul are all engaged in something, and this is what Jung's work is all about. Jung's work is about engaging with the symbolic material that is our heritage and coming into a new relationship. He talks about how the real creative people in religion are the mystics,
Hmm.
because the mystics are not just doing the forms of religion, but they're meeting those realities through their own meditations, through their own deep contemplations, often through their own physical exercises of different kinds, their ascetic exercises, you know. And so it's a new way of relating and uh, engaging them. And Jung talks about, having to know what the traditional language of the church is, and then find one's own way. And it's between those two poles where that new engagement, that new energy, that yoga that you're talking about, I think that comes out of that,
Mm.
where each person is experiencing their own relationship. And then you do the work of kind of trying to connect it in some way to tradition so that you're not
Yeah, out there
going
on your
off into,
own. Yeah.
right, but not necessarily just kind of locking it in and closing down the new. It's about bringing a kind of artist sensibility to the work.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm gonna get through the rest of your book and see if there's any more questions I have. But I think I love leaving it there with this invitation to start to engage in a participatory way and in an imaginative way with some of these symbols that might be troubling us. Like
Yeah, yeah.
if the white surfer Jesus troubles you, well, maybe do a meditation where you try to connect with how Jesus wants to present himself to you, and draw your own picture to put on the altar or something. But just as a way to like bring it into the tangible and the practical, like how to do this. So working with imagination and meditation, and allowing for how it wants to be revealed to us individually, I think is a beautiful invitation.
Right, right. It puts the initiative back on the energy, on the symbol. We don't have to impose anything. It can tell us how it wants to come forward.
Yeah.
And that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, but then the other piece of what you said, I think too, is important, that not we just that doesn't mean we just make up a new story of Christianity, but through doing that, and so what, going to my own experience. So this is how it's worked for me, is allowing for that, allowing it to come up fresh within me, this engagement with these Christian symbols allows me to go into a church like the one across the street from where I taught yoga, and to not like be triggered by any perception I have of a dogmatic structure or storyline or anything, but I can go up to an image of the Christ and feel a deeper connection that goes beyond the kind of surface representation of that particular image,
Right,
right? It's like I'm connecting to the heart and soul of Christ or of Mary or of Saint Michael. And I'm not really bothered so much by how he or she is represented in that particular instance, right?
right, right. Absolutely. I mean, the image becomes a window. It becomes transparent to what's beyond it. It might even throw the name out. It might even say, it doesn't even have to go by the name of Mary or Jesus, but it becomes the window through which you connect to the kind of pulsing energy behind it.
Okay, we did end up getting to the archetypes because this is what we're talking about, right? So, what does the image of Mary help me connect to? And if that particular form of that image is blocking me from connecting to the good, nurturing mother, maybe I find a different image, or maybe I allow my own image of her to form in my own psyche, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
But don't let it block you from connecting to that archetypal energy, which is transformative and which is nourishing.
Right. Absolutely. That's exactly right. There's a great line from Alan Watts who says, the whole kind of thrust of, say, the Christian tradition is the core image is always pointing away from itself. It's always pointing beyond itself. Christ is crucified. It's like you have to go beyond your image of it. And then he's resurrected, and Mary Magdalene goes up and sees him, and he says, don't cling to me. Right? That's the heart of it. Don't cling to it. You hold all of these things loosely. You look beyond it. They're all fingers pointing at the moon.
Or maybe be like Thomas and go up and actually poke him and say, look, are you real, man?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I mean, what an interesting image after what we've talked about with all the kind of woundedness, like the doubting Thomas, it's poking a wound. And so that's going to be kind of like tender and painful, right? Like that doubt that we have about the validity of our ancestral religion or Christianity or whatever, that doubt that we have about it, there's something in that. Like, yes, we should doubt. We should kind of poke at it to see, to evoke some feeling, first of all, to not just let it be some easily dismissed thing, like if we don't feel it, it's easier for us to go, oh, Christianity, yes, pedophiles and corruption, and I just want nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
It stops us from engaging in that kind of feeling and the provocation that you talked about, like poking at it, poking at us.
Right. But not just being a sort of blind adoption of it either, to be able to test
to
it.
Doubt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is great. I'm so happy that we talked and that our conversation went this way. We ended up where I thought we might, or hoped we might. And so there we go.
Awesome. That's awesome. This is fun stuff.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for spending some time with us. And if people want to find out more about you, your website is, tell me, is jungiantherapist.com?
Jungiantherapist.net.
.net.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Jason Smith, and the name of your podcast is Digital Jung. You can find it on iTunes and Spotify and all those places. And the book is religious, but not religious. And it's all about living a more symbolic, meaningful life. So thanks so much. And I really recommend everyone check you out.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Brian. This has been fun to talk with you. It's great.
Great. Okay. Well, take care.
You too.
Hey, thanks for listening and making it this far. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider subscribing and leaving a positive review on iTunes or a thumbs up on YouTube. If you'd like to support the show, you can share it with your friends or become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/medicinepath, where you can listen to the full podcast archives and podcast extras, plus access hours of yoga practice resources and discounts on my online yoga courses. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, and the rains fall soft upon your fields, until we meet again on the medicine path.